On a quiet February morning in Carroll County, Georgia, a 6-year-old girl stumbled into a nightmare no child should ever see, her mother and stepfather lying lifeless in their bed. The 911 call that followed seemed at first like the desperate cry of a grieving teenager, but as the days turned into weeks, whispers began to spread. How could the bright, church-going daughter of the victims, the same girl who delivered a tearful eulogy that went viral, suddenly become the prime suspect in their murders? Was Sarah Grace Patrick a heartbroken child caught in a tragedy beyond her control, or a calculating teenager hiding a secret so dark it shattered an entire community? This is not just another true crime story, it's a case that has divided families, churches, and an entire state, leaving America to ask, when innocence and guilt blur, who do we believe? On the night of February 20th, 2025, Carroll County, Georgia, was wrapped in the kind of silence only small towns know, a quiet broken not by the hum of traffic or city lights but by the faint rustle of trees and the distant bark of a dog. It was the kind of stillness where tragedy feels unimaginable until it happens, and that night, behind the walls of a modest family home, unimaginable horror unfolded in the most intimate of places, a parent's bedroom, where Kristen and James Brock, respected in their church and admired by neighbors for their generosity, lay side by side in bed, never knowing it would be the last night they would share together. The following morning, when dawn broke and the world outside stirred to life, inside that home an innocent 6-year-old girl opened a door and stepped into a nightmare that would scar her forever, for she was the first to discover her mother and stepfather's lifeless bodies, shot in their sleep, a scene no child should ever be forced to witness. Her screams pierced the quiet and drew the attention of her older sister, 17-year-old Sarah Grace Patrick, who quickly dialed 911 with a voice that trembled with urgency, reporting the deaths of her mother and stepfather, her words painting the picture of a tragedy that felt like the work of a heartless intruder or some cruel twist of fate. And the community, upon hearing of the crime, rushed to comfort the surviving children and to pray for a family struck by such cruelty. Yet, from the very beginning, the details were strange: the lack of forced entry, the precision of the attack, the unsettling way the bodies were found, suggesting not chaos but cold deliberation. And as investigators arrived, carefully moving through the home with gloves and cameras, documenting every detail, the house became less a sanctuary and more a crime scene, where bloodstains and silence told a story more chilling than words. Neighbors whispered about who could commit such a crime, about whether it was a robbery gone wrong or someone with a vendetta, and in those first fragile hours, Sarah appeared to be another victim of fate, a teenager thrust into adult responsibility, comforting her younger siblings, crying alongside church members, and standing before a community that rallied around her with casseroles, prayers, and the kind of Southern compassion that comes in times of loss. But as the days passed, law enforcement began to piece together fragments that didn't add up: the ballistic evidence that suggested a weapon belonging to the household, the digital footprints that pointed to late-night activity on Sarah's devices, the absence of any sign of struggle that one would expect from an outside attacker. And while the town mourned, investigators quietly began to shift their focus, compiling what they would later describe as mountains of physical and digital evidence, a phrase that would echo ominously in courtrooms and headlines months later. Yet on that first day, none of that was known. What was known was only the unbearable grief of a family torn apart, a church mourning the loss of 2 beloved members, and the haunting image of a small child, her innocence shattered in an instant, clutching a blanket as police led her away from the only home she had ever known, while her older sister, Sarah, the same girl who made the 911 call, wiped away tears and stepped into a role that would soon transform from grieving daughter to suspected killer, leaving everyone to wonder, even before the arrest came, how such darkness could grow in the heart of someone so young. and whether the story that began with one child's screams in the early hours of morning was far more twisted than anyone could have imagined. To understand why this case has gripped an entire nation, we have to look beyond the crime scene and into the life of the girl at its center, for Sarah Grace Patrick was not, at first glance, the kind of teenager anyone would imagine capable of cold-blooded murder. She was the quiet, church-going daughter who sang hymns on Sundays, attended youth group events, and was described by friends as gentle, reserved, and even shy, the type of girl who bowed her head in prayer at family dinners and smiled politely at elders, a young woman raised in a small-town culture that values respect, tradition, and faith. In fact, many who knew Sarah before that tragic February night described her as the perfect daughter, an image reinforced by her social media posts that showcased Bible verses, choir rehearsals, and wholesome snapshots with friends, the kind of carefully curated life that radiated innocence. But as with so many stories that later become true crime obsessions, the surface told only part of the story, and beneath it lay the complicated, messy, and often invisible struggles of adolescence. Sarah lived in a blended household, with her mother Kristen remarried to James Brock, a man described by some as stern but fair, though others hinted at tension between him and Sarah, and while her younger siblings seemed to adapt to the family dynamic, there were whispers that Sarah felt isolated, trapped between the expectations of a devout Christian upbringing and the private battles of a teenager yearning for freedom. Those who sat beside her in church pews would later recall the way she cried during worship, as though carrying a burden no one could quite see, while classmates remembered a girl who excelled academically but grew more withdrawn as the years went on. Yet at the same time, there were darker undertones, reports that she struggled with discipline at home, that arguments with her mother and stepfather sometimes turned heated, and that behind the perfect facade of family portraits, there may have been tension strong enough to plant the seeds of resentment. Still, even with these whispers, few could reconcile the sweet girl in the choir loft with the teenager police would one day accuse of murder, and so the community leaned on what they knew best. They believed in her innocence, because to imagine otherwise would have been to accept the unthinkable, that the smiling daughter they had watched grow up in their pews, classrooms, and neighborhoods could have harbored a darkness deep enough to pull a trigger. And yet, the cracks in the perfect daughter image were already showing in subtle ways: her fascination with crime content online, her late-night interactions on TikTok where she sometimes presented herself as more worldly and edgy than her church persona suggested, and her occasional posts that hinted at loneliness and yearning for escape. In hindsight, these were breadcrumbs, pieces of a larger puzzle that would only make sense once the tragedy had already unfolded, but at the time, they were dismissed as normal teenage behavior. What was not dismissed, however, was the powerful role Sarah played in the days immediately after the murders, standing at her parents' funeral, delivering a tearful eulogy that moved the congregation to sobs, speaking of love and faith and loss in a voice that shook with apparent grief, a performance so convincing that it went viral online, shared thousands of times as viewers across the country praised her strength and mourned with her. But later, when she was arrested, that same video would take on an entirely different meaning, replayed with chilling suspicion as people asked whether the tears were genuine or a calculated mask, whether the perfect daughter had been grieving or performing, and whether the image of innocence had always been a carefully constructed illusion. This duality, the sweet girl versus the suspected killer, would become the defining tension of the case. One that split the community into two camps: those who insisted Sarah was framed, misunderstood, or pushed to a breaking point, and those who saw in her an unsettling reminder that evil does not always wear a monstrous face. Sometimes it wears the face of the girl sitting next to you in church, smiling as though she could do no harm. In the aftermath of Kristen and James Brock's murders, Carroll County law enforcement faced a crime that seemed, at least at first, like the kind of nightmare that would demand an outside suspect, a masked intruder, or a shadowy figure lurking in the night, but as investigators began their meticulous work, combing through the Brock household room by room, bagging evidence, photographing the bedroom from every possible angle, it became clear that this was no ordinary home invasion, for there was no forced entry, no broken locks or shattered glass, no sign of a robbery gone wrong, only two parents executed in their bed with chilling precision, leaving behind children who would forever be marked by that single act of violence. From the beginning, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation and even federal agencies were brought in to assist, knowing that the smallest overlooked detail could be the key to justice, and what they found was a trail of clues that began to point not outward but inward, toward the very person who had dialed 911 in trembling tones, Sarah Grace Patrick. Ballistics tests linked the bullets to a gun belonging to the household, a weapon investigators believed had been accessed not by a stranger but by someone inside the home, and while this finding alone did not seal Sarah's fate, it planted a seed of suspicion that grew as digital forensics came into play. In an era where nearly every teenager's life leaves a trail across the internet, Sarah's devices became a treasure trove of potential evidence, and what detectives uncovered was staggering: late-night searches, messages that hinted at restlessness, and communications with friends and online acquaintances that revealed a side of her life few in Carroll County had ever imagined, a side that contradicted the innocent church girl narrative and suggested a teenager who, at the very least, was more complicated than her reputation implied. The investigators worked quietly, aware that in a small town, rumors travel faster than facts, and so while the community rallied around Sarah, offering prayers and casseroles, law enforcement pieced together a timeline, reconstructing the hours before and after the murders with painstaking care, interviewing neighbors, friends, and relatives, searching for anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual, and what emerged was not the shadow of a stranger but a portrait of opportunity, access, and behavior that, when combined, painted Sarah as the prime suspect. Still, the authorities moved cautiously, because to accuse a 17-year-old of murdering her own mother and stepfather was not only shocking but potentially divisive, a decision that would rip a community in half. So they built their case brick by brick, testing DNA, examining fingerprints, analyzing phone records, and compiling what the district attorney would later call mountains of physical and digital evidence, a phrase that struck like a hammer when it was first spoken in open court. Yet during those early months of investigation, Sarah seemed untouchable in the eyes of many locals, continuing to attend church, posting occasional updates online, even delivering her now famous eulogy at her parents' funeral, her voice breaking as she described her mother's smile and her stepfather's steady presence, a performance so moving that many wept openly, never imagining that the girl speaking those words might herself be under suspicion. And it was this very tension, the gulf between the grieving daughter and the suspected killer, that kept investigators both focused and cautious, for they knew that when the arrest came, it would ignite a firestorm of disbelief, anger, and defense. As the spring of 2025 turned into summer, the case reached a boiling point, and law enforcement, convinced they had gathered enough evidence to stand before a grand jury, prepared for the moment when the image of Sarah Grace Patrick would forever shift from grieving daughter to accused murderer, a transformation that began not with a single dramatic revelation but with the slow, careful unfolding of an investigation that left little room for doubt, though plenty of room for heartbreak. As investigators dug deeper into the question of motive, opportunity, and character, one of the most revealing paths led not through the Brock family's home or neighborhood but through the glowing screens that had quietly documented Sarah Grace Patrick's inner world, because in the 21st century, every teenager's private life often unfolds publicly online, and Sarah's was no exception. When detectives gained access to her phone, tablet, and laptop, what they uncovered was a digital trail that both fascinated and horrified them, a breadcrumb path of late-night searches, cryptic social media posts, and private messages that painted a portrait of a girl far removed from the smiling, soft-spoken teenager who sang in church choirs and volunteered at school events, for beneath the curated facade of innocence lay a restless, volatile online persona, one that engaged with influencers, shadowy internet friends, and communities that blurred the line between fantasy and dangerous ideation. Sarah's TikTok and Instagram accounts, some public, others under pseudonyms, contained everything from light-hearted lip-sync videos to darker, more ambiguous content, song lyrics about betrayal, clips about teenage rebellion, even trending true crime hashtags that investigators would later argue hinted at a growing obsession with violence and control. But it was her private messages that became the smoking embers of a fire prosecutors would fan in court, threads where she vented about feeling trapped at home, about her mother being too strict and her stepfather always watching, about wanting a new life and sometimes even suggesting that the only way out was permanent, final. Some messages revealed communications with online personalities who promised her validation, attention, even love, fueling the narrative that she was seeking escape and recognition beyond her small Georgia town. And while defense attorneys would later argue that these were the harmless dramatics of a teenager venting in exaggerated tones, prosecutors insisted they were breadcrumbs of intent, the early sketches of a plan that would culminate in violence. Adding to the unease was the discovery of her following and engagement with influencers known for edgy, rebellious, or nihilistic content, digital figures who celebrated breaking free of family expectations, who glamorized running away, and in some cases who explicitly blurred the line between fiction and criminal curiosity. And while none of these influencers could be tied directly to the crime, the sheer volume of Sarah's digital interactions with them created an image of a girl both impressionable and determined, someone straddling the dangerous threshold between teenage angst and real-world consequence. What troubled investigators most, however, were the search histories, queries about how to make death look like an accident, how many gunshots are fatal, and how long does gunpowder stay on your hands, chillingly specific searches that prosecutors would later describe as a script, while defense attorneys argued they were nothing more than morbid curiosity fueled by the very true crime media that so many American teens consume. Still, when you place these searches alongside the fact that Sarah had ready access to her stepfather's firearm, the narrative tightened into something more sinister, and as journalists caught wind of these digital findings, headlines began to sensationalize the story, portraying Sarah as a girl next door with a secret online life of darkness. And this dichotomy, between church eulogies and chilling Google searches, ignited the public's fascination, drawing national media coverage and endless debate shows asking whether this was a case of a cold-blooded killer or a vulnerable teen caught in the toxic swirl of social media pressures, family conflict, and digital addiction. To the investigators, however, the story was becoming less ambiguous by the day, for every text, every screenshot, every timestamp added to a growing body of evidence that Sarah's digital life wasn't simply an escape, but a roadmap that, when traced backward, seemed to lead directly to the bedroom where her parents' lives ended. And though the court of public opinion would remain divided, the court of law would treat these pixels, messages, and searches as hard evidence, proof that in the 21st century, the path to truth often winds not through eyewitness testimony but through the digital shadows of our own making, leaving Sarah Grace Patrick standing at the heart of a case that was as much about technology and modern teenage culture as it was about blood and tragedy. The courtroom in Carroll County became the stage for one of the most emotionally charged legal battles the community had ever witnessed, a clash not only of facts and evidence but of narratives, morality, and perception, where a teenager's future, and perhaps her very identity, hung in the balance. When Sarah Grace Patrick was first led into the courtroom for her bond hearing, the sight was surreal to many who had once seen her as a smiling cheerleader, a church volunteer, and a young girl beloved in her neighborhood, yet now she appeared in an orange jumpsuit, shackled, her head bowed under the gaze of flashing cameras and the unblinking stares of journalists and townspeople who filled every available seat, some out of morbid curiosity, others out of personal grief, and still others seeking justice or answers. The prosecution wasted no time in painting Sarah as a danger to society, a manipulative teenager capable of cold-blooded murder, emphasizing the brutality of the crime and the chilling digital trail investigators had unearthed, searches about guns and death, private messages laced with resentment toward her parents, and the eerie irony that she had stood at their funerals delivering a eulogy while allegedly hiding the knowledge of her own role in their deaths. Prosecutors described her as a flight risk, arguing that granting bond to a defendant capable of such duplicity would endanger both the community and the integrity of the judicial process, and they leaned heavily on the notion that Sarah's youth, far from exonerating her, actually masked a dangerous cunning, a reminder that evil does not always wear the face of a hardened criminal, but sometimes of a 17-year-old with a sweet smile and a smartphone. The defense countered with equal vigor, led by attorneys who framed Sarah as a scapegoat of circumstance, a traumatized young girl unfairly targeted in the midst of grief and hysteria, and they hammered the inconsistencies in the state's narrative, arguing that online searches could be the reckless curiosity of any teenager obsessed with dark media, that venting in texts did not equate to pulling a trigger, that physical evidence tying her directly to the shootings remained inconclusive, and above all that the presumption of innocence must not be sacrificed to the court of public opinion. They reminded the judge and jury pool of Sarah's age, her lack of prior criminal history, her role as a student with a future, and they sought to humanize her, describing her as a daughter who had endured strict parenting, loneliness, and perhaps even emotional isolation, asking the court to see not a monster but a child in need of compassion and understanding. As each side presented, the spectators reacted, some nodding along with the prosecution's call for justice, others whispering in sympathy with the defense's plea for mercy, and the tension in the room was palpable, almost cinematic, as if the entire town were being asked to choose between two competing realities. Was Sarah a cold killer or a misunderstood victim of circumstance? The highlight of the hearing came when the prosecution played clips of Sarah's funeral speech for her parents, juxtaposing her soft-spoken tribute with the evidence of her digital searches, suggesting a chilling duplicity that left many gasping, while the defense condemned the tactic as emotional manipulation, an unfair conflation of grief with guilt. Ultimately, the judge's decision to deny bond came down not to emotion but to the perception of risk of flight, risk of tampering with evidence, risk to public trust in the justice system, and when he spoke the words denying Sarah's release, a hush fell over the room, broken only by the quiet sobs of her relatives and the clicking of reporters' keyboards. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted into debates, interviews, and social media live streams, with hashtags about Sarah trending nationally, some calling her a child killer, while others decried the case as another example of a system quick to condemn troubled youth. This courtroom battle was only the beginning, yet it cemented the trial as not just a local case but a national spectacle, one where every motion, every testimony, every exhibit would be dissected on news channels and podcasts, and where the outcome would ripple far beyond Carroll County, sparking conversations across America about juvenile justice, parental authority, mental health, and whether a teenager could truly comprehend the weight of life and death decisions, making it clear that in the trial of Sarah Grace Patrick, the courtroom itself had become the battleground for America's deepest anxieties about crime, punishment, and the blurred lines between innocence and guilt. As soon as the courtroom doors closed, the trial of Sarah Grace Patrick escaped into the wild arena of American media, where facts, speculation, and emotion collided in a storm that no one in Carroll County could have anticipated, and almost overnight, a local double homicide case transformed into a national obsession. Cable news channels rolled out special coverage with dramatic music and sensational headlines like Killer Teen, or Daughter or Murderer, while podcasts dissected every rumor, every leaked message, every courtroom detail with forensic zeal, and true crime YouTubers pumped out videos that reached millions, their thumbnails plastered with Sarah's smiling school photo beside images of police tape and blood-smeared graphics. Social media turned into a battleground of narratives, with hashtags like #JusticeForThePatricks trending alongside #FreeSarahGrace, each side attracting legions of passionate supporters, some condemning her as a heartless sociopath who betrayed her own family, others defending her as a scapegoat of lazy investigators in a society eager to vilify troubled youth. TikTok edits of her funeral speech circulated widely, spliced with ominous music or tearful commentary, and these clips often blurred the line between empathy and entertainment, raising uncomfortable questions about how tragedy becomes content in the digital age. Journalists camped outside the courthouse and even outside Sarah's relatives' homes, thrusting microphones into the faces of grieving family members, who themselves became divided, some calling for the harshest punishment, others quietly begging for understanding and remembering Sarah as a child who once laughed at birthday parties and played with dolls. America's armchair detectives took to Reddit, poring over crime scene maps, speculating about motives, and even accusing random acquaintances of involvement, while psychologists on talk shows debated whether a teenager's brain could fully grasp the consequences of murder, invoking studies of adolescent impulse control and emotional immaturity to suggest that Sarah, guilty or not, might represent a broader failure of society to recognize and address teenage mental health. Churches weighed in with sermons about sin and forgiveness, neighbors clashed in grocery store aisles, and former classmates sold their stories to tabloids, each recollection adding fuel to the fire of public curiosity. What made this media frenzy especially volatile was Sarah's image itself. The juxtaposition of her innocent face against the horror of the charges created a narrative Americans couldn't look away from, because it forced them to ask whether the monsters we fear could hide in the people we least expect. And as weeks turned into months, the saturation of coverage ensured that the trial was no longer about two tragic deaths in Georgia but about America itself, its hunger for sensational crime, its thirst for quick judgments, and its uneasy reckoning with how easily public opinion, whipped into a frenzy, can shape, or even corrupt, the pursuit of justice. By the time jury selection loomed, it was nearly impossible to find citizens untouched by the case, for Sarah Grace Patrick had become more than a defendant, she had become a symbol, a mirror reflecting both the darkness of crime and the spectacle of a nation addicted to watching it unfold in real time. The day of the verdict arrived like the final act of a drama that had gripped not only Carroll County but the entire nation, and as the courtroom filled with reporters, family members, and silent onlookers, every breath seemed to hang suspended in the air, waiting for the 12 jurors to decide whether Sarah Grace Patrick would walk free or spend decades behind bars. When the forepersons stood and delivered the words, "Guilty on the counts of malice murder and felony murder," the gasps and muffled sobs echoed like thunder, shattering whatever fragile hope remained for those who had clung to Sarah's innocence, while others felt a grim satisfaction, believing that justice for two lives cruelly stolen had finally been served. Sarah herself barely flinched, her face pale and unreadable, though some swore they saw her lips tremble as she whispered something to her attorney, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a denial, perhaps simply the word "why." The sentencing hearing was a spectacle of pain and division. Prosecutors painted Sarah as cold and calculating, a teenager capable of adult cruelty, while the defense pleaded for mercy, reminding the court that she was still a child when this tragedy unfolded, a child whose future had already been annihilated long before the gavel fell. When the judge pronounced life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years, the room seemed to split in two, with one side embracing justice and closure, and the other collapsing into tears of despair, convinced that a broken girl had been condemned rather than healed. Outside, media swarms captured every anguished face, every trembling hand, every heated exchange between divided family members, and as the footage aired across America, the case of Sarah Grace Patrick cemented itself in the annals of modern true crime, not just because of the brutality of the act, but because of the haunting questions it left behind. How could a teenager commit such a crime? Was she shaped by hidden abuse, untreated mental illness, or a darkness no one could see until it was too late? And what does it say about America that so many turn the tragedy into a spectacle, consuming it like entertainment while the real lives of a family lay in ruins? In the months and years after the trial, the case continued to echo, books were written, documentaries released, law schools debated its legal implications, and social media kept Sarah's name alive, some still demanding her release, others warning that she embodied the dangers of youthful rage unchecked. For Carroll County, the scars never fully healed, the memory of 2 lives lost and a daughter damned lingered in church pews, school hallways, and dinner table conversations, a reminder that even the most ordinary places can become stages for the unthinkable, and for the nation, the verdict was less an ending than a mirror held up to its face, reflecting uncomfortable truths about justice, punishment, forgiveness, and the terrifying possibility that the line between innocence and evil can sometimes run straight through the heart of a child. In the end, the case of Sarah Grace Patrick is not just about guilt or innocence, it is about the fragile fault lines of family, the darkness that can grow in silence, and the uneasy truth that tragedy rarely offers simple answers. 2 lives were lost, a community was shattered, and a teenage girl now spends her youth behind prison walls, a symbol of both justice served and innocence forever lost. Perhaps that is why this story continues to haunt us, because it forces us to confront questions we would rather avoid. How well do we really know the people we love? What warning signs do we ignore until it is too late? And can justice ever heal the wounds of a crime that tears a family apart from the inside? For Carroll County, for Georgia, and for America, the name Sarah Grace Patrick will forever echo as both a cautionary tale and a chilling reminder that sometimes the most unimaginable horrors are born not from strangers in the shadows, but from within our own homes.